I've heard you talk a bunch about limiters. So how do those play into your model in training? And can you talk a little bit about each one of them and how we might see them show up in training on any given day or any given workout and how we react to it?
Yes, so previously I would classify limiters in more of like that traditional energy system based model. Like this person is very enduring and they have a very powerful oxidative system, or we would say like this person is very powerful, like their ATP PCR system is like off the charts. But knowing what I know now, which is that these processes aren't uncoupled on the range of seconds to minutes to hours. Like all of these processes are occurring within like 100 milliseconds. So we can't uncouple these different processes from each other. Like all training's aerobic, all training's lactic, like everything is everything. So we've had to move away from trying to classify things with this bottom down approach, and instead we could look at the body as a system of systems. So the analogy that I always use is a car factory. Since I know nothing about cars whatsoever, I talk about like a Hot Wheel factory instead because it's a little bit simpler and I could comprehend it. So if we have a Hot Wheel factory and let's say we have like a conveyor belt line and we have 3 steps on this conveyor belt process, we'll put the wheels on these Hot Wheels cars, we'll put the paint or the wrap on them, and then we'll box them up. And these are the only 3 steps. So let's say putting them in the boxes at the end, that's the slowest step in this factory line. And if we want to make like a fat stack of cash and get more of these Hot Wheels out the door, we need to figure out where the rate limiting step is. So if we decide, okay, we're going to double the amount of machines that are putting wheels on these Hot Wheels cars, and then we check back a week later and we're like, we're not making any more Hot Wheels cars than we are before because that's not the rate limiting step. The rate limiting step was boxing these cars up. So instead what we did is we just have a bigger pile of cars waiting to get boxed up and none are getting out of the factory quicker. So a better approach would be, okay, let's find the rate limiter in this factory process, boxing up those cars, and we'll double the amount of machines there. And now we're getting more of those cars out the door quicker. We could look at the body in the same way. When we're doing maximal effort exercise, there's thousands and thousands of processes that are occurring simultaneously, but there's actually a very small amount that are going to end up being limiting factors for performance. If we're talking about energy system-based events, those are primarily going to be the respiratory system, which is going to function to get oxygen into the body and get CO2 out of the body. We have the delivery or cardiac system. So after oxygen comes into the lungs and diffuses into the blood of the alveoli, the heart's responsible for getting that oxygenated blood to the working muscle. And then we have the what we call like muscular oxidative capacity, but in practical terms, oxygen utilization. So these are the 3 main limiters that we see. So if an athlete's limited by their respiratory system, the way that we would see this on Moxie trends would be that if we're doing like a step test, we'll see they're progressively getting less and less oxygen into the working muscles. So we know, oh, this is an oxygen supply issue. And the other thing that we'll see is they're progressively getting more and more blood driven into the muscle when it's not under tension. If we think about what the respiratory system does, it gets O2 in. So if it's coming to a point of failure, we see less oxygen, but it also is meant to get CO2 out. And if we're not getting enough CO2 out, CO2 is a vasodilator, so we open up those capillary beds and all this blood's going to start in the muscle. And we'll also see if we're measuring it with a different device that these athletes' brains aren't getting as much oxygen while they're doing these tests. If someone's limited by their delivery system or their heart, we'll also see they're not getting enough oxygen into the muscle, but we'll see completely different blood flow trends. So we'll generally see these athletes are clamping down on the muscle and they're creating a lot of vasoconstriction. So these athletes get a lot of occlusion and they're cutting off blood flow a lot. Then we could also see that someone's limited by oxygen utilization, which means they're getting enough oxygen into the muscle, but they're just not utilizing it. The way that I usually think of that one, it's like, let's say I give you a debit card and I'm like, hey, there's $100,000 on this debit card, and this is the only money that you have for the next year. Buy all your food with this. Like you could buy a ton of food, but I forget to give you the PIN number to this debit card and you end up starving to death. And from the outside, people would be like, wow, like he had hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on food, but like he starved. Like it doesn't make sense. And it's like, well, that's because you couldn't utilize the money you had. It's the same thing with the utilization limitation. They have plenty of oxygen in the muscle. They just can't utilize it. So they end up failing even though it's like, dude, the food's there. Just use your PIN number and unlock it. So I've moved away from seeing limitations in this like pathway dependent view to more of these systems that could be limiting performance.
Are those limiters exercise specific or movement specific or pattern specific, or do you find them? It's just say an athlete is their main limiter is the respiratory system, for example. Do you see that in every exercise and in every test, or does that kind of depend?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So to add a little bit more nuance, so I would think of limitations in three different ways. We have event-specific limitations, energetic limitations, and then, for lack of a better term, what we call like our global compensation pattern. So on an event-specific limitation, let's say I'm a respiratory limited athlete. If I go do an 100-meter sprint, I'm not going to be limited by my respiratory system because that event selects for rate of oxygen utilization. So I'm probably going to be limited by utilization there. Similarly, I could take a utilization limited athlete, but if I have them go and run an ultra marathon, they're probably not going to be limited by oxygen utilization on that event because the utilization demands are going to be so low. Then we have our energetic limitation, which is the three that we were just talking about. And then where the model really comes to fruition is what we call the global adaptation trend. So this is the set of compensation patterns that someone's body undergoes by virtue of their limitation mixed with the type of training that they're doing. So for example, if you're a delivery limited athlete and your primary training sport is CrossFit, so you're doing CrossFit 4, 5, 6 days a week, when CrossFit athletes are delivery limited, they get a very specific set of compensation patterns. For these athletes, one of their biggest issues is that their cardiac output is very weak compared to the amount of tension they could create in their muscle. So what this ends up creating is a scenario where these athletes are always cutting off blood flow to the working muscle while they're doing CrossFit. So for them, a CrossFit Metcon is kind of like doing VFR work. I'm sure you've seen some of those athletes that do CrossFit where like they just get super yoked doing CrossFit and like they don't even do hypertrophy training. You're like, yo, this guy's doing burpees and wall balls 5 days a week, but he has an FFMI of like 24. And that's because that's a compensation pattern that occurs. Like there's nothing fundamental about being delivery limited that makes someone jacked. But when you're delivery limited and your sport is such that you're doing very high reps of movements alternating body parts, it's going to make you more prone to hypertrophy. So I'm always thinking about training in those different ways. Like, how are you limited on this specific event? What is your primary or energetic limiter? And then what compensation patterns are you creating through like environmental stressors? And then that's going to dictate like how you regulate adaptation as an individual.